All right, guys, welcome back for another video on sin and talking about the nature of sin, the origins of sin. In the last video, we looked at where does sin come from, the origins of not just for men, but even for all creatures, originating in the will and plan of God. So what we're going to talk about today is God's sovereignty over sin in the world. And what we mean by the sovereignty of sin is in what manner, to what degree is God sovereign over all that unfolds in the world, even sin by human beings, right? By creatures made by Him. To what degree is He sovereign over their actions, and why would He be sovereign over sin? Right? We're going to get into some of those issues. Obviously, Brandon, one of the questions this brings up, and I'll let you kind of think through this, is this raises the question: does that make God the author of sin?
Right.
A lot of people ask this question.
Yeah.
If you say God's sovereign over sin, does that make Him the author of it? Does that make us not responsible for it ultimately? What are your thoughts on that? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, so most Christians don't want to say that God didn't know sin was going to come.
You can't say that.
You can't say that. But we also don't want to say that God is the author of sin, meaning that we don't want to say He caused it. So God doesn't cause sin to happen, but He does ordain sin to happen. Right. And those are two different things. If He causes it, then He's a sinner. If He ordains it, it means He is using sin for His redemptive purposes. And we see that all the way leading up to the cross. A great illustration I read from Bruce Ware in a book called God's Greater Glory. He uses an illustration of a drug deal. And so he says, think about police officers who are on a stakeout in a van, and they send in an undercover cop to buy drugs from a drug dealer. When the drug dealer sells the drugs to the cop, then they go and they arrest the drug dealer. He's taken to court, he's prosecuted. The cops are not prosecuted at all. They're not in trouble for buying the drugs. And so he says this is how God ordained sin. They controlled the circumstances. They caused all these things to happen, but they used evil, His evil, which He's responsible for. They're not responsible for it. The drug dealer's responsible. They used it for good. And so that's what God does. God controls all circumstances meticulously. He uses sin, without being the author of it, to accomplish good, and the sinner is still held responsible.
That's really good. That's a great illustration.
It's a great illustration. I think it's also important to note that we have a good working definition of sin. So one thing that, just to paraphrase, one of the catechisms is that it's any want of conformity unto the will of God. And so, in one sense, accusing God of being the author of sin, in the sense that He Himself is a sinner, is a contradiction in terms anyway.
Right.
And so, I like the way that MacArthur says it also. MacArthur says, and I might have said it on these videos before, but that at the heart of all sin is autonomy, meaning self-rule apart from God.
That's good.
And so,
I agree with that.
Yeah. So in that sense, God can't be responsible for sin directly anyway, because sin is always something that's in relation to His goodness. And so that might be a little heady, getting up in the clouds a little bit on that. But to your point, quoting Edwards again, or not quoting, but one of the things that Edwards said when he was pressed on this, and I think Calvin might have said it too, was what do you mean by the author of sin? Yeah. If by the author of sin you mean did He create a world in which this would exist to whatever, then Edwards even said, I have no problem calling Him the author of sin.
Right, if you're going to define it that way.
Yeah,
right.
He said, but what most people mean when they say that is what they mean by that is God directly responsible for the evil that men commit.
Right.
And to which he says absolutely not, because men are responsible for their own evil regardless of the world that God created, because they do what is in their hearts. And consequently, that's what we're judged for, right? At the end of the day, we're judged for our actions, but even more so, we're judged for the evil desires of our hearts.
And we have real autonomy to make choices.
That's
we
right.
have real volition to make choices, which is how God can hold us responsible for it, right? And we may not be able to perfectly untangle all the ways in which God is completely sovereign over our lives, or even our choices, and yet how we are still 100% making those choices, desiring those choices. No one will ever be able to look at God and say, you made me do this.
That's right.
Right? Nobody will be able to say that.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I was just made me think. I was listening to Spurgeon this morning, and he was talking about.
You were listening to Spurgeon?
Well, no. I was listening to a guy reading.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
I was like, bro, where'd you find that archive?
I could get famous off that.
You could.
No, I was listening to a guy reading one of Spurgeon's sermons called "The Power of the Holy Spirit," which consequently is an amazing sermon. But he's talking about free will in that, and Spurgeon says, I absolutely have free will to commit all the sin that I want to commit.
No doubt.
And just that idea that God is not forcing anybody to disobey His will.
Yep.
He's allowing them to disobey His will for a purpose.
So let's talk about primary means and secondary means. A lot of times this comes up. I think it'd be helpful for listeners and viewers to understand God's role in activities that unfold versus our role. The distinction has often been made primary, secondary. As we prepare to define that, let me maybe put some color to it, right? Sure. So in the story of Joseph, you see a perfect example of primary, secondary causes. In the story that unfolds, we actually don't see anything in the storyline until the very end that God is involved in this, right? That God is meticulously working and acting. What we see is Joseph's brothers betray him.
Yep.
Right.
What we see is Potiphar's wife lie about him. What we see is that Joseph goes to prison for years, by the way, for years. He's forgotten even after he properly interprets a dream for the cupbearer, and they forget about him and don't actually say, hey, it was Joseph that told us this.
Yeah.
Until finally he is brought out after interpreting a dream a second time. He eventually ascends to the right hand of Pharaoh in power. His brothers come before him. He finally reveals himself, and when they say, oh, my mercy, he's going to kill us, Joseph's mercy toward them is rooted in his belief and understanding that God is the one that put him there.
That's right.
And he actually makes the statement. He says it in two different places, but in Genesis 50:20, he says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good.
That's right. Yeah, not used for good.
Used.
God didn't pick up the
Meant.
scraps.
Yeah, both of them meant.
Designed. Yeah.
Designed. And what's really fascinating about that is in Joseph's language, he makes it very clear that man involved in his story, his brothers, Potiphar's wife, everybody involved meant what they did for the evil that they brought about.
That's right.
Right.
But God, acting simultaneously, was meaning it or meant it for good. And ultimately, we know that good is that he's going to be there to spare God's covenant people, the people of the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's going to spare them from famine and be a promise keeper. Right. He's going to keep his promise. Talk about that primary, secondary picture for a moment and help people understand. In light of that story, understand a little bit of that.
Well, I think it goes back to the original illustration I just gave, is that God is ordaining these circumstances in which these creatures, these characters, are making choices that they want to make.
Right.
Joseph's brothers, they wanted nothing more than to kill him at that moment.
That's right.
But then somebody else's will intervenes, Reuben's, who then causes their wills to shift and sell him into slavery.
That's right.
So it wasn't God's will for him to die.
That's right.
It was God's will for him to be sold to slavery and to go to Egypt. It was Potiphar's wife's will to pursue him and then to lie about him. But God is the one who is author over all the things that are happening.
That's right. So he's the primary reason why these things are unfolding.
Yeah, he's ordained all the not only the big picture, but the meticulous circumstances. And in these circumstances, all these creatures are carrying out their will.
That's right.
Which is causing God's plans to be accomplished.
That's exactly, and which is fascinating.
Yeah,
it's fascinating. So, Nick, there's other examples in the Bible of this happening, but what would be, do you think, the greatest picture of this happening?
The greatest picture would obviously be the cross. So you picture, I think Jesus is God incarnate. Right. And how is he viewing the events that are before him that he knows how they're going to end? Is he viewing it as God moving people around like robots? Right. No. Is he viewing it like God is just waiting for the people to do the right thing in the right set of scenarios?
He's definitely not sitting there thinking, boy, I hope they do what they're supposed to do.
I hope the algorithm turns out right. You know what I mean? He's viewing it as this is definitely going to happen. And all of these people are definitely making their own choices. Yeah. And so if that's the way that God incarnate views it, and that's the way that we should view it, and Peter says as much in Acts chapter 2 when he's given his sermon, and he says that that Jesus was delivered over by the definite foreknowledge of God. Yeah. And he looks at the religious leaders and he says, yet you are the ones who crucified and killed the Lord of glory.
It's both right there.
It's both.
He holds them responsible. You crucified the Lord of glory, the King of glory. And yet all this was according to the definite plan of God.
That's right. But think about it even more simple terms. So you talked about the meticulous providence of God, and you can't get more meticulous than Jesus' own example when he says, not a sparrow falls from the sky apart from my Father's will. How do you get away from meticulous providence when Jesus is saying things like that? Yeah. And then on the first and second causes thing, just think about it like this. Is it right to say that God caused the sun to rise this morning?
Yeah.
It's right to say that.
Yeah.
Right.
And you could even say it. You could even say it not just metaphorically, because if God removes His power, Christ upholds all things.
Yeah.
Right. If God removes His power in relation to the sun rising this morning, will it rise?
It won't.
It won't rise. So
Right.
in one sense, God is the author of the sun rising in the morning. But at the same time, we know that He has set certain laws in motion in the universe.
That's right. The secondary causes.
Yeah, so we might get some bad weather tonight,
Right.
right? Is it right to say that God brings that storm? Well, yes.
Right. Yeah.
But is it also this reaction of air temperatures and all these? Yes, it's both and.
Right. That's good.
Yeah, that's good.
I think pastorally, as we think about this, and maybe as people are listening, what we don't want them to hear is, oh, well, God's sovereign even over my sin. So it's like, hey, when I sin, I can just say, well, you know, the Lord is probably doing something through this.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
What God has revealed to us is that we are to be holy,
Yeah.
Yeah.
that we are to obey. He has not revealed to us all the ways and means by which He's going to even use our failings and our wickedness and our rebellion. So it's not for us to try to play God to go, hey, if I do this sin, then God's probably going to do this. Like, that's wickedness.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So I would
Those
just
are
say
the secret things.
That's right. The exhortation for us is obey God.
Right.
Be holy. Consecrate yourselves to the Lord. But know this, that in the midst of your living and moving and having your being, when people sin against you or you sin, you need to understand that God is at work even through and in all of those different things, because that's who He is. And the reason we have the scriptures and these examples like this is not to show us the few times that it happened. It's to actually demonstrate for us what is normative.
That's right.
God is always at work
right.
in these things.
So just on the not sinning, that God may be glorified, right? So Romans, Paul talks about that ad
That's
nauseum.
right.
But on the other end of it, to the believer that is lamenting for the sin that they committed, and in view of the sovereignty of God, I'll never forget the first time the Lord really just comforted my heart with this. And what came to mind was the idea that there's no waste in the economy of God.
That's right.
That even my sins, though I'm responsible for them and I'm to repent of them, but when I look back on them, I can still say this is in the plan of God for my sanctification and for His glory.
That's right.
Which is a marvelous thought to the believer who doesn't want to sin. It's a marvelous comfort.
That's
Yeah,
exactly
I
right.
think on the flip side of that, to the person who says, well, if God is sovereign, then what choices do we really have? And how could I not have made that choice? You know, if God is sovereign, then I was destined to make that choice. And Paul says, who are you to answer back to God?
Right.
You know, I mean,
That's
the rhetorical question is basically that what choice did I have? You know, if He's sovereign, then I had to make that choice.
Right.
And Paul says that is not for you to discuss. You know, who are you to answer back to God? Will the what was molded say to the molder, why did you make me this way?
That's
Yeah,
right.
Romans 9.
You know, so, you know, the Bible doesn't give the full answer to compatibilism, God's sovereignty and man's responsibility.
Right.
It just tells us that we are to take these things by faith. You know, and to Spurgeon, he was asked, you know, how do you reconcile these things? He says, I don't need to reconcile friends.
Right.
That's
You
right.
don't have to reconcile friends.
They're friends. They are held together in this glorious paradoxical tension in the Scriptures, and we are to accept them by faith.
That's right. So we believe the Bible. So
Right.
when the Bible tells us God is in control of all things, we believe it. And when the Bible tells us that we are to obey, act on the will of God, live according to what He has revealed to us, that is what we're responsible for.
Yeah.
So we'll wrap this up here, and we'll come back together and continue to talk about the extent of how sin has affected humanity in the world today.
Yeah.
Good.